She's a corrupting influence.
I agree. We don't want our dancers thrusting like savages.
Hey, speak for yourself.
Don't get flipped with me.
I'm not. Look, now, I got some new ideas for the show. First, we get rid of Negro Day.
Finally, some sense out of you.
And we mix those kids in with the rest of the council.
Mix those kids?
That's right, I said it.
Is this not a black and tan cocktail?
Well, why couldn't it be? Velma, isn't this where it's all heading anyway? Now, you can fight it, or you can rock out to it.
Maybe it is time for some fresh ideas. Like a nice, fresh, new host.
Gee, Velma, how do you fire Corny Collins from the Corny Collins Show?
They do it all the time on Lassie.
Velma, you've let this go too far.
Me?
Fix it!
What?
Fix it!
Oh!
Hey, look out for that moving van driving down our streets. You better lock up your man before he meets the new girl in town who just came on the scene.
Tracy Face whoopee cushion. Good choice. We got you Tracy souvenirs for days. Here, you sign photos. Tracy wigs.
Whoa, 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 we don't know what to do about the new girl in town. The new girl in town seems to dance on air. The new girl in town, she's got the coolest hair. You better tell the homecoming queen to hold on to her crowd. Oh, whoa, 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 or she's gonna lose it to the new girl in town.
That big little girl is sending my sales through the roof. More people are breathing aerosol than oxygen.
Think you could show some of those new dance moves? Yeah, sure. And pretty flowers.
Tracy, wait up!
She's hip, so cool. I'm gonna get her after school. And yet we'd like to be like her, 'cause she's looking at the cat's prefer. The new girl in town has a guy on the string. The new girl in town, look, she's wearing his ring. I can't stop crying, and so in my tears I'm gonna drown. Whoa, 'cause he wants to rendezvous with the new girl. We're kinda sad and blue, yes it's true, girl. We like to say to the new girl in town. The new girl in town.
Hi, I'm here to see Tracy Turnbull.
Where's her write-up?
She doesn't need a detection slip. She's coming. Penny, this is Seaweed. Seaweed, this is Penny.
To the new girl in town. The new girl in town. Hey, look out for that moving van. Look out, look out, look out, look out. She was the new